The sermon is starting out by going to the dogs, just so you know that. So what happens when the lost are found? Can we rejoice and celebrate when the lost are found, no matter what our journey is? Let's think about this from the least threatening place we could start with. That's what I mean by going to the dogs, because we love stories of dogs that have been lost and are found, don't we? We watch those on Facebook and movies. We read those in books. Let's think about dogs who've been lost, who are found like strays living at the animal shelter for a long time, who finally find their forever home. That's a joy. We cry over commercials and stories about lost and found dogs, but we are not quite as sympathetic to lost human stories. For people who have wandered off the pathway, unless crisis has happened, we're pretty sympathetic to those. But not so much when people simply get themselves lost by their decisions. Let's hang on to this example a little bit longer. When those stray animals are received into a new home, if the family already had one or two dogs, how do those original pets welcome the new dog? Let's think about that for a minute. Do they welcome the new dog, or do they feel a little displaced by all the welcome and celebration around that new adopted pet? If the newcomer takes a lot of time and attention, maybe those who were there before get worried that they're not loved so much anymore. Maybe they even try to prove they're as worthy as the newcomer. Prove to everybody, aren't I good too? What about me? That's our human nature to ask that question. What about me? Thinking about this in terms of dogs today seemed like a non-threatening way to approach this, because as soon as we translate Jesus choosing to save lost people over people who've never strayed, we start considering who should be saved or included based on their merits, rather than simply being glad for the mercy and love offered to those who are lost. So here comes that main point to remember, or the phrase that pays. Let's celebrate when anyone who is lost is found, because God does. Let's celebrate when anyone who is lost is found, because God does. In today's reading, all kinds of people were gathering up to hear what Jesus had to say, even the tax collectors and sinners, and people weren't welcoming them. From the view of the scribes and Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day, the people that Jesus was attracting was becoming kind of a scandal, because Jesus received outcasts, people who usually stayed on the edge of things because they knew that the good people wouldn't respond to them if they had talked to them. They'd be scorned. Jesus would share a meal with anybody who showed up, even the people who were designated as sinners, meaning that they'd broken moral laws or maybe hadn't kept up with purity customs. So the religious people murmured. Remember the Israelites murmuring behind Moses' back when they were wandering in the wilderness? Grumpy, grumpy, what are we doing here with him? Today we might call that gossiping or disrespecting or dissing someone. Jesus was often the center of attention, whether he came to preach or to heal, or was even just looking for a drink of water. Wherever Jesus was, he looked around to see who was missing among those who were gathered around him. He looked to see who didn't feel welcome. He looked to see who was lost from the group, and then he went to find them so that they didn't feel left out. And Jesus was inviting the religious leaders to think about this by telling them a few parables instead of confronting them. He was inviting them to see themselves and decide whether they could seek those who were lost, or whether they could celebrate anybody when anybody who was lost was found. Jesus was inviting those religious leaders to the urgency of seeking the lost and the joy that God feels when people are found, like the shepherd finding the one sheep that was lost, or the woman finding the one coin. The scribes and Pharisees, though, were the 99 sheep who were never lost, or the handful of coins the woman held on tightly to, because they had never been in danger of losing touch with God. But they were missing an opportunity to do what God wanted them to do. Because God rejoices in heaven when each lost person is found and back in relationship with God. God responds with mercy rather than scolding or judgment or punishment. And to join in celebrating lost people finding God, we need to find happiness in that and be willing to share our God with others that may have been lost and are now found. But sometimes we get our nose out of joint because God isn't celebrating us in the same way. We get grumpy when we start to feel that God is really good to others, and just as God always has been with us. We slip into judgment pretty easily. And our challenge continues to be celebrating when anybody lost is found without judgment. Being found by God and in relationship with God can look different ways. It could look like somebody showing up here we haven't seen for a long time, showing up here on a Sunday morning, and we'll need to just welcome them without any questions asked. And it could look like running into somebody you used to attend church with and hearing that they found a new church home and their faith journey continues. And we'll need to be glad that they've found their way, even as we're telling them that we're missing them here in this place. Or it could look like the day we run into somebody who's found God and the blessings of the week and they're rejoicing. You'll need to rejoice with them, even though your week feels like you've been caught out in a meteor shower. And their joy makes you feel like you're just grumpy with God because it's been a rough week. We all have those weeks. The struggle to celebrate others and our begrudging feelings when things don't go as well for us is an important dynamic to recognize within ourselves. It's a little like sibling rivalry among God's children when the attention isn't focused on us. And we need to be as self-aware as we can be about that. Can we celebrate the best things happening to somebody else when it's not us? Or does everything need to be about us for us to truly feel like things are going well? When we are secure in our relationship with God, we can give thanks just for that each and every day. We can simply be glad when someone who's been lost is found, even if it's not us being celebrated. There's a lot of controversy today over what we teach in the history we share, whether it's the history of our people or our country or our faith. Today's reality is that most often history is conveyed to us by the people that history happens to celebrate. But the people not celebrated, or the ones not telling the story, often get lost in transmitting history generation to generation. In any good story of what has been our history, most often we need to take another look at it and ask ourselves who's missing. Who were the people who must have been there who are missing in that account of history? Who's been lost from the celebration of these historical events? That's how Columbus Day has also morphed into being Indigenous Peoples Day. And there are other realizations that we're still working on with that. I pray that the day will come when we'll be able to hear all of God's people's perspectives of history together, and we'll all be able to celebrate together when anybody lost from the story is found. May we find the grace it will take to include everybody in the story of who we are as God's people. Jesus always looked for whoever was lost and needed to be found. So that's his example from long ago to us today, to take a look at any celebration and see who's missing from it, see who's not part of the story, because there's room for the whole diversity of God's people to be celebrated at any time in God's creation. And the act of being glad for others is offering grace, meaning love and forgiveness and care. Celebrating other people, people who are different than we are, is part of sharing grace. And God offers grace to all of us freely. It's not something we have to earn. It's just something there for us to receive from our God. And that's something we can celebrate each and every day. When anybody who's lost is found, let us give thanks together. Amen. Amen.